9 children stood in silence, covered in dust, hunger, and heartbreak. One by one, families walked past them looking away. No one wanted another mouth to feed. No one wanted another burden. Then, just as the last wagon prepared to leave, a lone cowboy stepped forward carrying a crying little girl in his arms. He slammed his fist onto the wooden table so hard the tin cups rattled across it. "Every last one is mine." Those 5 words changed 9 forgotten lives forever. But what happened in the months that followed would leave an entire frontier town questioning everything they believed about family, courage, and sacrifice. Stay with me until the very end, because this story has an ending few people ever see coming. And if stories of hope, courage, and unforgettable Wild West heroes inspire you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin. The summer sun hung high over the rugged Montana Valley, casting long shadows across the weathered ranch buildings that stood beneath the towering Rocky Mountains. Horses shifted inside wooden corrals while a dry wind carried dust through the quiet frontier settlement. Outside the county office, 9 orphaned children stood shoulder to shoulder, their patched clothes hanging loosely over thin bodies that had learned far too early what hunger felt like. None of them cried anymore. They had already cried too much. The youngest, a little 5-year-old girl named Lily, clutched the worn sleeve of her older brother Samuel, whose 11-year-old shoulders carried far more responsibility than any child should ever know. Around them, townspeople whispered softly as wagons rolled into the yard. Families had answered the sheriff's notice. The children needed homes. Yet one after another, hopeful moments dissolved into disappointment. A farmer chose a strong teenage boy, but refused to take his younger sisters. A widow considered adopting one little girl, until she learned she had 8 siblings. Another rancher looked at the children as though they were livestock before shaking his head and walking away. The brothers and sisters watched every wagon disappear with another piece of hope. Samuel never let go of Lily's hand. He had promised their dying mother that they would never be separated, even if the world forgot they existed. By late afternoon, only silence remained. The sheriff removed his hat and rubbed his tired face. He hated days like this. He had seen outlaws show more mercy than some respectable citizens. He quietly told the children they would likely be sent to different orphanages hundreds of miles apart by week's end. Lily finally began to cry. The older girls lowered their heads. Even Samuel's promise started to feel impossible. Just then, the distant sound of galloping hooves echoed across the valley. Everyone turned toward the dusty road leading into town. Riding through the cloud of dust came a broad, shouldered cowboy wearing a faded brown hat and an old leather vest scarred by years of honest work. His horse slowed beside the gathering, and before anyone spoke, the cowboy gently lifted a frightened little girl from his saddle. She wasn't one of the 9. She was another orphan he had rescued weeks earlier, after losing her parents during a harsh mountain blizzard. She buried her face against his shoulder, still trembling whenever strangers stared at her. The cowboy looked across the line of children, saying nothing for several long seconds. His weathered face revealed years of hardship, but his eyes softened the moment they met the frightened expression standing before him. "Who's taking these children?" he finally asked. No one answered. The sheriff quietly explained everything. 9 brothers and sisters, no relatives, no one willing to keep them together. The cowboy slowly walked toward the table where adoption papers lay waiting. He glanced at each child, noticing the worn boots, patched dresses, scraped hands, and frightened eyes trying so hard not to hope anymore. Samuel stepped slightly in front of his younger siblings as though protecting them from yet another rejection. The cowboy recognized that look. Years ago, he had worn the very same expression after losing everyone he loved. His jaw tightened. Without another word, he placed the little girl securely on one arm, raised his gloved fist, and slammed it against the rough wooden table. The sharp crack echoed across the entire ranch yard. Tin mugs jumped. Papers fluttered into the wind. Every conversation stopped. Every face turned toward him. His voice thundered across the valley with a strength no one expected. "Every last one is mine." The words hung in the silent air like a promise carved into stone. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the horses seemed to stand still. But the sheriff knew immediately this moment would change every life standing in that dusty ranch yard forever. For several long seconds, no one dared speak. The sheriff stared at the cowboy as if he had misheard him. A ranch hand quietly laughed under his breath, believing it had to be some kind of joke. 9 children, one man. Even the wealthiest ranchers in the county would hesitate before taking on such a responsibility. But the cowboy never smiled. His weathered hand rested firmly on the shoulder of the crying little girl in his arms, while his other remained planted on the table, where his fist had struck. His eyes never left the frightened children standing together. "I said every last one," he repeated, his voice calm now but no less certain. "Not one of them gets left behind." Samuel blinked in disbelief. He had heard promises before. Adults often spoke kind words that vanished as quickly as the wind across the prairie. He tightened his grip on Lily's hand, waiting for the man to change his mind. Instead, the cowboy walked directly toward the children and slowly knelt so he wouldn't tower over them. "My name is Jacob Hayes," he said gently. "I don't know what you've been through, but if you'll trust me, you'll never have to wonder where home is again." None of the children answered. Hope was dangerous. It hurt more than disappointment. The oldest girl, 13-year-old Anna, studied the lines on Jacob's face. She saw scars earned from hard work, not cruelty. His hands were rough, but the little girl resting against his shoulder clung to him without fear. That told her more than words ever could. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Jacob, this isn't like taking in one child. Feeding 10 young mouths through winter will cost a fortune. Your ranch isn't one of the biggest around." Jacob nodded. "I know exactly what it'll cost. You'll need clothes. We'll make them. Medicine. I'll earn it. Schooling. They'll have it. Food through winter." Jacob looked toward the distant mountains before answering quietly. "Then I'll work from sunrise until long after sunset." The sheriff lowered his eyes. There was nothing more to argue. Yet the townspeople weren't finished. One wealthy cattle owner stepped forward with crossed arms. "You're making an emotional decision, Hayes. Children aren't cattle. They cry. They fight. They get sick. 9 orphans with nothing but painful memories will tear your life apart." Jacob slowly turned toward him. "No," he replied. "Loneliness tears lives apart. Love puts them back together." The words settled over the crowd like a sudden silence after thunder. An elderly woman standing beside her wagon wiped tears from her cheeks. Others who had walked past the children moments earlier suddenly found themselves unable to meet their eyes. They had judged those children by the size of the burden instead of the size of their hearts. By sunset, the papers had been signed. One by one, each child climbed into Jacob's large wagon. No one rushed. No one celebrated. They were too afraid this beautiful moment might disappear before morning. Lily hesitated before climbing aboard. Jacob offered his hand without saying a word. She stared at it for several seconds before placing her tiny fingers into his rough palm. He lifted her gently beside the others. It was the first time in weeks she had stopped crying. The ride home stretched for miles across rolling grasslands painted gold by the setting sun. The younger children leaned against one another, while the older ones quietly watched the mountains growing larger ahead. Finally, Jacob pointed toward a distant ranch, surrounded by cottonwood trees. "See that smoke?" he asked. "That's supper waiting." Several children exchanged confused glances. Supper waiting for them? The ranch wasn't grand. Its fences leaned in places. The barn had weathered countless storms. The log cabin showed years of hard use, but warm light glowed through every window, and flowers bloomed beside the porch despite the dry summer soil. As the wagon rolled into the yard, an old sheepdog barked happily before racing toward the children with its tail wagging wildly. Chickens scattered across the yard while 2 gentle horses lifted their heads from the pasture. Everything felt alive. Everything felt welcoming. Jacob helped each child down one by one. No speeches, no grand promises, only quiet kindness. Inside the cabin, a large wooden table had already been prepared. Fresh bread cooled beside a steaming pot of beef stew. There were exactly 10 bulls waiting. Anna stared at them in disbelief. You knew we'd come," she whispered. Jacob smiled softly. I hoped. The children looked at one another, and for the first time since losing their parents, they allowed themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, this lonely ranch beneath the mountains was no longer just someone else's home. Maybe it was becoming theirs. The seasons changed, and so did the children. The frightened faces that had once expected rejection were now filled with laughter, confidence, and hope. Jacob taught the boys to ride and mend fences, while the girls learned to bake, garden, and read beside the fireplace. Every evening, all 10 children gathered around the same wooden table, where no seat was ever empty. They were no longer orphans. They were a family. The townspeople who had doubted Jacob slowly witnessed the impossible. His ranch flourished, not because he had more money, but because he had more hands, more hearts, and more love. One by one, neighbors began bringing supplies, books, blankets, and even livestock. The man they once called foolish had reminded an entire community what true courage looked like. Years later, when people asked those children how they had survived losing everything, they always gave the same answer. The day nobody wanted us, one cowboy chose all of us. Jacob never became famous. No statue was built in his honor, but in the hearts of 9 once forgotten children, he became something far greater, a father. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes kindness can change lives. Because sometimes, one brave decision is all it takes to give someone a family forever.